As we leaf through the pages of the Old Testament, we are transported to an ancient world, filled with traditions and rituals that shaped Hebrew culture for millennia. Among these practices, funeral ceremonies held a prominent place, reflecting not only respect for the dead, but also deep beliefs about the afterlife and the relationship between the divine and the human. Burial was undoubtedly the predominant method of dealing with remains in the biblical context. This practice was not mere coincidence. It carried a profound meaning rooted in the very narrative of creation. After all, was it not from the dust of the ground that the Creator formed the first man? And was it not decreed that he would return to the dust? This cycle of life and death, so poetically described in the Scriptures, found its tangible expression in the act of burial. Imagine walking through the hills of ancient Canaan, where natural caves and rock-hewn tombs dotted the landscape. These sites were not simply repositories for the dead. They served as points of connection between the past and the present, between the living and those who had already departed. The importance placed on these final resting places was such that many biblical narratives specifically mention the acquisition of land for burial, as in the case of Abraham purchasing the cave of Machpelah to bury his beloved Sarah. But the funeral tradition of the Old Testament was not solely about burials. In rare and notable exceptions, we find accounts of cremation. The most famous case, without a doubt, is that of King Saul and his sons. After a disastrous battle against the Philistines, their bodies were retrieved and burned by the men of Jabesh-Gilead. However, it is crucial to note that this act was not seen as an honor, but as an extreme measure, possibly to prevent further desecration by the enemies. The rarity of cremation in the biblical context raises intriguing questions about the reasons behind this preference for burial. Was it merely a cultural issue, or were there deeper theological implications? Some scholars suggest that the preservation of the body through burial was linked to the hope of resurrection, a concept that, while not fully developed in the Old Testament, was already sowing its seeds in Israelite faith. The rituals accompanying burial were elaborate and laden with symbolism. Mourning was expressed in visceral ways, with tearing of garments, covering oneself in ashes, and public lamentations. These acts were not mere formalities, but genuine expressions of grief and respect. Additionally, they served as a way for the community to come together in times of loss, offering consolation and mutual support. It is fascinating to observe how these funeral practices intertwined with other aspects of Hebrew life and faith. For example, the concept of ritual impurity, associated with contact with corpses, profoundly influenced the interaction between the living and the dead. Priests, in particular, had specific restrictions regarding this interaction, reflecting the constant tension between the sacred and the profane in the Israelite worldview. As we examine these practices, it is impossible not to reflect on how they shape our own understanding of death and mourning. What lessons can we draw from this ancient wisdom? Perhaps the deepest is that death, as painful as it may be, is not the end of the story. The meticulous care for the dead reflects an unshakable belief in the dignity of human life, which persists even after the last breath. The funeral practices of the Old Testament invite us to contemplate our own mortality and the legacy we will leave behind. How do we wish to be remembered? What mark do we want to leave on this world? These are questions that transcend time and culture, echoing through the millennia from the patriarchs to us. As we reflect on these ancient traditions, we are reminded of the importance of honoring those who came before us and cultivating a perspective that sees beyond the limited horizon of our earthly existence. Funeral practices were not just about dealing with death, but about affirming life and its continuity through the generations. It is curious to note how, even in a culture that valued burial so highly, there was room for exceptions like Saul's cremation. This reminds us that even in the most entrenched traditions, there are always nuances and complexities that challenge simplistic generalizations. The story of Saul invites us to consider the exceptional circumstances that sometimes require deviations from established norms. As we contemplate these ancient practices, we cannot help but marvel at the richness of meanings and symbols that permeated every aspect of life and death in Hebrew culture. Every gesture, every ritual, carried with it a weight of history and belief that connected the individual to something greater than themselves. As we progress in our exploration of biblical funeral traditions, we are naturally led to consider the profound symbolism that permeates the entire narrative of the Scriptures. In particular, the image of dust, so central to burial practices, invites us to reflect on fundamental themes of creation and human mortality. How does this powerful metaphor of dust shape our understanding of life, death, and the divine purpose for humanity? In the biblical narrative, few symbols are as recurring and profound as dust. From the early pages of Genesis to the last breaths of the prophets, this simple yet powerful image permeates the Scriptures, weaving a rich tapestry of meaning and theological implications. From dust you came, and to dust you shall return. This emblematic phrase echoes through the millennia, capturing the essence of the human condition in its brevity and fragility. Imagine for a moment the arid plains of the ancient Near East, where the wind stirs clouds of fine dust, constantly reminding the inhabitants of the region of their intimate connection to the earth. It is in this setting that the creation narrative unfolds, with the Creator shaping the first man from the dust of the ground. What more vivid image could there be to illustrate the relationship between the divine and the human? The breath of life breathed into Adam's nostrils transforms lifeless dust into a living being, a powerful metaphor for the divine ability to create life from the seemingly lifeless. But the symbolism of dust is not limited to creation alone. It serves as a constant reminder of human mortality. When God pronounces judgment on Adam after the fall, the mention of returning to dust is not just a description of the physical process of decomposition, but a profound statement about the transient nature of human existence. It is an invitation to humility, a call to recognize our fundamental dependence on the Creator. Throughout the Scriptures, we find characters who embody this deep understanding of their own dust. Abraham, when interceding for Sodom and Gomorrah, declares himself dust and ashes before God. Job, in the midst of his suffering, laments being made from dust, only to return to it. These expressions are not mere exercises in false modesty, but genuine reflections on the nature of humanity in relation to the divine. The symbolism of dust invites us to a deep reflection on the value of life. If we are dust, what is the purpose of our ephemeral existence? This question has echoed in the hearts of philosophers and theologians throughout the centuries. The biblical answer is paradoxical. It is precisely our fragility that gives life its invaluable worth. Every moment becomes precious, every action significant, when viewed through the lens of our mortality. Consider for a moment how this understanding could transform our approach to daily life. What decisions would we make differently if we saw each day as a precious gift, knowing that one day we will return to dust? Perhaps we would find ourselves more inclined to forgive, more eager to learn, more willing to love unconditionally. The symbolism of dust also carries profound implications for the understanding of resurrection. If God was able to create life from dust once, why could He not do so again? This hope of renewal and recreation permeates the Scriptures, culminating in the glorious visions of a new creation in the prophetic and apocalyptic writings. It is fascinating to observe how cultures around the world have echoed this symbolism in their own traditions. From the ancient Egyptians, who viewed dust as an essential component in the preservation of the dead, to Hindu traditions of scattering the ashes of the deceased in sacred rivers, the connection between dust and mortality seems to be a universal constant. But returning to the biblical narrative, it is important to note that the symbolism of dust is not uniformly negative. Yes, it represents our mortality, but also our connection to the earth, our earthliness, so to speak. There is beauty in the idea that we are integral parts of God's creation, formed from the same elements that compose the mountains and valleys. This connection to the earth reminds us of our responsibility as stewards of creation. If we are dust, we are not separated from nature, but intrinsically linked to it. How could we then not care for the world around us, knowing that we are made of the same material? The symbolism of dust also invites us to reflect on the fundamental equality of all humanity. Kings and servants, the rich and the poor, all share the same origin and destiny. This is a powerful message in a world often divided by superficial differences. As we contemplate the symbolism of dust, we are inevitably led to consider issues of legacy and impact. If our time on earth is limited, what mark do we want to leave? How can we transcend our ephemeral nature and contribute to something that endures beyond our brief existence. It is interesting to note how the concept of dust in creation and death intertwines with the funeral practices we discussed earlier. The act of burying the dead can be seen as an affirmation of this cycle, a literal return to the dust of the earth. At the same time, the hope of resurrection suggests that this return to dust is not the end of the story. As we reflect on these profound questions of life, death, and purpose, we cannot help but marvel at the richness of meaning contained in something as simple as dust. It is a testament to the genius of the biblical narrative, which uses everyday images to convey eternal truths. As we conclude our exploration of the symbolism of dust, we are naturally led to consider how these ancient ideas translate into the context of the New Testament. How do the coming of Christ and the message of the gospel interact with these fundamental conceptions of creation, mortality, and resurrection? What new perspectives emerge when we look at dust through the lenses of grace and redemption? As we turn the pages of the New Testament, we are transported to a world in transformation, where ancient Jewish traditions meet a new reality brought by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In this dynamic context, issues related to death and funeral practices gain new nuances and interpretations, often in subtle and indirect ways. It is noteworthy that the New Testament maintains an almost absolute silence on the specific issue of cremation. This silence, far from being insignificant, invites us to a deeper reflection on the priorities and emphases of the early Christian message. Were the first followers of Jesus so focused on the urgency of the evangelistic mission that questions about funeral methods became secondary? Despite this direct silence, the New Testament is by no means lacking when it comes to addressing death and what comes after. In fact, we find a powerful and recurring emphasis on the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. This emphasis not only echoes the hopes already present in late Judaism, but amplifies and reinterprets them in light of the central event of the Christian faith, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, dedicates an entire chapter, 1 Corinthians 15, to the question of resurrection. He argues vehemently against those who denied the possibility of a bodily resurrection, insisting that the Christian hope is intrinsically linked to the reality of resurrected bodies. If there is no resurrection of the dead, he argues, then Christ has not been raised. This direct connection between Christ's resurrection and the future hope of believers becomes a central pillar of early Christian theology. But what kind of body is this that is resurrected? Paul uses the fascinating metaphor of a seed that is planted in the ground. What you sow does not come to life unless it dies, he writes. This image evokes both continuity and transformation. The resurrected body, Paul suggests, will be both recognizable and radically transformed, sown in weakness, raised in power. It is interesting to note how this metaphor of the planted seed aligns with traditional burial practices. Could this be an indirect affirmation of these practices? Or is it simply a powerful image to communicate a spiritual truth, independent of specific funeral methods? The Gospels, in turn, offer us intriguing glimpses of the resurrected body of Jesus. He is described as being able to pass through closed doors, still bearing the marks of crucifixion, but also capable of eating and being touched. These descriptions challenge our usual categories and invite us to expand our understanding of what it means to have a glorified body. The emphasis on bodily resurrection in the New Testament raises fascinating questions about the nature of human identity. Are we more than our minds or souls? The early Christian perspective seems to insist that our full humanity includes our corporeality, a view that has profound implications not only for our expectations about the afterlife, but also for how we live and value our bodies in the present. This valuation of the physical body in the context of resurrection interestingly contrasts with some philosophical currents contemporary to the New Testament, which tended to see the body as a prison of the soul. The Christian message, on the other hand, affirms the value of the body, viewing it not as something to be discarded, but as something to be redeemed and transformed. At the same time, we find in the New Testament a healthy tension between the affirmation of the body and the recognition of its temporality. Paul speaks of our current earthly tent, in contrast to the eternal building in the heavens that awaits us. This language suggests both continuity and discontinuity between our present and future existence. It is fascinating to observe how these New Testament perspectives on the body and resurrection have influenced Christian practices and attitudes toward death throughout the centuries. From the early martyrs, whose remains were revered as seeds of resurrection, to the elaborate medieval tombs that expressed hope in future resurrection, we see a rich and varied tradition of dealing with death in light of this hope. But the New Testament does not limit itself to speaking about a distant future. The resurrection of Christ is presented as having profound implications for the present. Believers are urged to live as raised with Christ, a spiritual reality that should manifest in a transformed life here and now. This emphasis on the already and not yet of the resurrection invites us to reflect on how our beliefs about the afterlife shape our ethics and behavior in the present. If our bodies are destined for resurrection, how does this affect the way we treat them and those of others? What implications does this have for issues of social justice, healthcare, and human dignity? It is important to note that despite the emphasis on bodily resurrection, the New Testament maintains a delicate balance, avoiding excessive speculation about the exact details of the afterlife. Paul acknowledges that we are speaking of mysteries, and the Gospels report the appearances of the resurrected Christ with a mix of concreteness and mystery. This balance between affirmation and mystery may offer us a clue on how to approach practical issues such as funeral methods. If God's power to resurrect transcends our understanding, perhaps the exact way we treat the remains is less crucial than the spirit in which we do it and the hope we maintain. As we reflect on these New Testament perspectives, we are inevitably led to consider how they have been interpreted and applied throughout the history of the Church. How did the early Christian communities navigate their Jewish roots and their new Christ-centered understanding? And how did these interpretations evolve as Christianity spread across different cultures and faced new challenges? These questions naturally lead us to explore the diverse theological interpretations that have emerged over the centuries, shaping the Christian understanding of death, the body, and resurrection. As Christianity expanded beyond its Jewish roots, confronting new cultures and philosophical challenges, theological interpretations of death, the body, and resurrection began to diversify and evolve. This process, far from being linear or uniform, was marked by heated debates, creative syntheses, and at times controversies that reverberated for centuries. One of the most persistent and fascinating debates throughout the history of Christian theology centered on the question of the integrity of the body for resurrection. Did resurrection require the physical preservation of remains? This question was not merely academic, but had significant practical implications for burial practices and the understanding of the very nature of life after death. In the early centuries of Christianity, we find a strong trend in favor of burial, partly influenced by Jewish practice, but also reinforced by the emphasis on bodily resurrection. Theologians like Tertullian argued vehemently against cremation, seeing it as a denial of Christian hope. For them, the body was a sacred temple, destined for future glorification, and should be treated with reverence even in death. However, as Christianity confronted Greco-Roman thought, more nuanced interpretations emerged. St. Augustine, a crucial figure in shaping Western Christian thought, addressed the issue with remarkable sophistication. While favoring burial, he argued that God's power to raise the dead did not depend on the physical preservation of remains. Neither the earth nor the sea, nor even heaven itself can prevent the Creator from restoring what He has created, Augustine wrote. This more flexible perspective paved the way for broader theological debates about the nature of human identity and the relationship between soul and body. While some Christian thinkers, influenced by Platonism, tended to emphasize the immortality of the soul, others insisted on the importance of the psychosomatic unity of the human being, seeing bodily resurrection as essential to the fullness of redemption. The Middle Ages saw the emergence of elaborate theories about the intermediate state between death and final resurrection. The concept of purgatory, primarily developed in Catholic theology, introduced new complexities into the understanding of post-death destiny. This, in turn, influenced practices such as prayers for the dead and the veneration of relics, which became integral to medieval piety. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century brought new questions and reinterpretations. Reformers such as Martin Luther and John Calvin, while maintaining belief in bodily resurrection, tended to emphasize justification by faith and God's sovereignty over any human practices related to the dead. This led to a simplification of burial practices in many Protestant traditions. It is fascinating to observe how these different theological interpretations were reflected in cultural and artistic practices. From the Roman catacombs, decorated with symbols of hope in resurrection, to the elaborate Gothic tombs that seem to anticipate the future glory of resurrected bodies, we see a rich visual tradition that expresses these theological beliefs. The advent of modernity and scientific advancements brought new challenges to traditional interpretations. How to reconcile belief in bodily resurrection with the growing knowledge of physical decomposition and biological processes. Christian theologians and philosophers found themselves navigating between the Scylla of literalism and the Charybdis of materialistic reductionism. In this context, more metaphorical or spiritualized interpretations of resurrection emerged. Some modern theologians proposed understandings of resurrection that emphasized the continuity of personal identity rather than the literal physical restoration of the body. Others sought to integrate insights from quantum physics and information theories to rethink what body means in a universe more complex than the ancients could have imagined. At the same time, the 20th century saw a renewed interest in the theology of the body, influenced in part by phenomenology and existentialism. Thinkers like Karl Rahner and John Paul II emphasized the importance of the body not merely as a vessel of the soul, but as an integral part of human identity and God's divine plan for redemption. These diverse theological interpretations throughout history have not remained confined to academic circles, but have had profound impacts on the practices and attitudes of Christian communities. The evolution of denominational views on cremation is a clear example of this. While some traditions have maintained a strong preference for burial, others have come to see cremation as an acceptable or even preferable option in certain contexts. It is important to note that these interpretations did not evolve in a vacuum, but in constant dialogue with the cultural, social, and economic realities of each era. Practical issues such as land scarcity for burials, environmental concerns, and changes in geographical mobility patterns have influenced and been influenced by these theological reflections. Another fascinating aspect of this historical development is how different Christian traditions have dealt with the tension between continuity and innovation. While some communities have firmly clung to traditional practices and interpretations, viewing them as bulwarks against secularization, others have sought to reinterpret ancient truths in ways that speak more directly to contemporary concerns. As we move into the 21st century, we find ourselves in a moment of unprecedented theological pluralism. Interpretations of death, body, and resurrection vary not only among denominations, but often within the faith communities themselves. This presents challenges but also opportunities for a richer and more nuanced dialogue about these fundamental issues. In this context of interpretive diversity, many contemporary theologians are drawing attention to the importance of maintaining a balance between doctrinal affirmation and epistemic humility. They recognize that when grappling with the ultimate mysteries of existence, our interpretations will always be provisional and limited. As we reflect on this rich history of theological interpretations, we are reminded of the complexity and depth of Christian thought regarding death and the afterlife. Each generation of believers has strived to articulate its hope in ways that are faithful to tradition and relevant to its context. This journey through theological interpretations throughout history naturally leads us to consider how these ancestral reflections relate to the realities and challenges of the contemporary world. How do today's Christian communities navigate between tradition and innovation, between conviction and openness, when dealing with practical and spiritual issues related to death and dying? These questions invite us to explore modern considerations of funeral practices and their theological and practical implications. In the contemporary landscape, issues related to funeral practices and the understanding of death take on complex nuances, reflecting the diversity and rapid changes in our global society. Christian communities, in particular, find themselves navigating between fidelity to ancestral traditions and the need to adapt to a constantly evolving world. One of the most prominent debates today revolves around the tension between individual freedom of choice and respect for established traditions. In an era that greatly values personal autonomy, many argue that the decision on how to deal with remains should primarily be left to the individual or family. This argument often hinges on the idea that funeral practices are a personal expression of faith and memory, not necessarily bound to specific doctrines. On the other hand, there are those who emphasize the importance of communal traditions and the collective testimony of faith. They argue that our choices about death and burial affect not only ourselves, but also our faith community and future generations. From this perspective, maintaining traditional practices such as burial can be seen as a way to affirm continuity with the past and hope for the future promised by God. Contemporary practical and cultural aspects also exert significant influence in this debate. Growing urbanization and the consequent scarcity of space for cemeteries in many areas have led to greater acceptance of cremation, even in traditions that historically rejected it. Additionally, environmental concerns have driven the search for more sustainable alternatives, such as eco-friendly burials or accelerated decomposition processes. It is fascinating to observe how technology is shaping new ways to deal with death and memory. Virtual memorials, streaming services for funerals, and even digital preservation of memories are becoming increasingly common. These innovations raise intriguing questions about the nature of presence and absence, challenging our traditional conceptions of mourning and remembrance. Globalization and the growing religious diversity in many societies also present new challenges and opportunities. Christian communities often find themselves engaging in dialogue with the funeral traditions of other cultures and religions, seeking a balance between maintaining their distinctive identity and respecting diversity. This intercultural dialogue has the potential to enrich our understanding of death and mourning, revealing perspectives that may complement or challenge established traditions. A crucial aspect of modern considerations is the growing awareness of the importance of healthy mourning and community support for the bereaved. Many churches are rethinking their pastoral approaches to grief, recognizing that the process of loss is complex and individualized. There is a growing trend to integrate insights from psychology and social sciences into pastoral care practices, seeking to offer more holistic support to those facing the loss of loved ones. The economic issue cannot be overlooked in contemporary discussions about funeral practices. The high cost of traditional funerals has led many to seek more affordable alternatives. This raises important questions about how to balance the desire to honor the dead with practical and financial considerations, especially in economically challenged communities. The COVID-19 pandemic brought these issues to the forefront in an unprecedented way. Restrictions imposed on traditional funerals and mourning rituals forced a rapid reevaluation of long-established practices. Many communities found themselves adopting creative solutions, such as virtual services or small group ceremonies, raising questions about what is truly essential in our funeral practices. A particularly interesting debate in the context of modern Christianity is how to balance the affirmation of hope in the resurrection with the recognition of the intrinsic value of the physical body. Some voices argue that an excessive emphasis on the afterlife can lead to a devaluation of the physical body and earthly realities. Others counter that it is precisely the hope in the resurrection that allows us to fully value the body, seeing it as destined for redemption and glorification. Bioethics and medical advancements also introduce new complexities into the debate about death and funeral practices. Questions about the timing of death, organ donation, and the limits of end-of-life care intertwine with theological considerations about the sanctity of life and the dignity of the human body. It is important to note that even in the face of these multiple modern considerations, many Christian communities continue to find profound meaning and comfort in traditional practices. The act of preparing the body for burial, prayer vigils, farewell rituals, these elements continue to play an important role in expressing faith and the grieving process for many believers. At the same time, there is a growing recognition that the diversity of practices within the Christian tradition itself can be a source of richness, not division. Many churches are adopting a more flexible approach, recognizing that different individuals and families may have varied needs and preferences when it comes to honoring their dead. A notable trend in contemporary discussions is the emphasis on the good death. The idea that the dying process can be an opportunity for spiritual growth, reconciliation, and meaningful preparation. This has led to a renewed interest in practices such as the anointing of the sick or end-of-life blessings, viewed not only as sacramental rites, but as moments of profound pastoral and spiritual significance. As we look to the future, it is clear that the dialogue about funeral practices and understandings of death will continue to evolve. Christian communities will be challenged to articulate their eschatological hope in ways that are both faithful to their tradition and relevant to a rapidly changing world. In this context of transformation and ongoing reflection, perhaps the most important question we can ask is not just about the specific methods we choose to deal with our dead, but about how our practices and beliefs about death shape the way we live. How does the awareness of our mortality and the hope in the resurrection inform our ethical choices, our relationships, and our search for meaning here and now? These modern considerations invite us to a continuous and reflective engagement with the fundamental questions of life, death, and the beyond. They remind us that while external forms may change, the human quest for meaning in the face of death remains a powerful constant, uniting us across generations in our shared journey of faith and understanding. Throughout this journey of exploring funeral practices and conceptions of death within the Christian context, we have traversed vast theological and historical territory. From the ancient practices of the Old Testament to modern considerations, we have seen how the understanding of death and the afterlife has evolved and adapted while maintaining a core of hope and meaning. The symbolism of dust reminds us of our mortality and connection to creation, while New Testament perspectives emphasize the promise of resurrection. The theological interpretations throughout history demonstrate the richness and diversity of Christian thought on these fundamental issues, and modern considerations challenge us to rethink our practices in light of new contexts and challenges. Ultimately, what emerges from this study is the understanding that our beliefs and practices related to death are deeply significant, reflecting not only our theology, but also our shared humanity. They invite us to reflect on how we live, how we love, and how we hope. What challenges do these reflections present for you? How can they inform your own faith journey and your understanding of life and death? Perhaps it is time to initiate meaningful conversations in your community about these profound issues. If you found this content valuable and want to continue exploring similar themes, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There is much more to discover and discuss at this fascinating intersection of faith, history, and contemporary culture.